And this leads to a second major area, what I call rewriting Scripture. Now, this push to use Hebrew words, along with some ideological and theological factors, has caused an increased rise in voices that claim that the New Testament was originally penned in Hebrew, not Greek. The reason they need to do this is because there's this big roadblock, this big speed bump standing in the way of their movement called the Greek New Testament. The Greek New Testament, hey, it exists. And without hesitation, the authors of the New Testament used the Greek form of the name Jesus. They never used either of the Hebrew forms, assuming that there were only two. They used Greek form of Jesus about 900 times, the Greek word for God about 1,300 times, the Greek word for Lord about 700 times. The Hebrew equivalents for God or Lord are never used in the New Testament. Likewise, although you can find the word Messiah in the New Testament, transliterated from Hebrew into Greek characters in two places in John, in both places John translates that into Christ for his Greek-speaking audience. The New Testament provides examples of early church leaders speaking in Greek, such as Paul on Mars Hill. If you remember that from Acts chapter 17, there's Paul in Athens, goes up to Mars Hill, and begins to talk to this group of Greek philosophers. Now, there is no way he's going to be able to communicate to them with them using Hebrew. So he speaks to them in Greek, and not only does he speak in Greek, he even quotes one of their own pagan Greek poets. And apparently Paul had no problem doing so in order to make his point. Acts describes some Hellenized Jews who spoke Greek in the early church in Jerusalem, such as Stephen, who became the first martyr. Although the New Testament provides clear evidence that Jesus spoke Aramaic, there are hints that he also knew at least some Greek. A classic example is a Syro-Phoenician woman, one of the most precious stories in the Synoptic Gospel. But here's Jesus talking to a Syro-Phoenician woman who, between Mark and Matthew, is described as a Canaanite and a Greek, meaning she was a Hellenized Gentile who spoke Greek as her primary language. This is just one indication that Jesus spoke some Greek. There's an instance in the Gospel of John where some Greeks, as they're called, came to speak with Jesus, and he spoke with them. Thus, the New Testament provides no basis for insisting on the strict use of Hebrew forms of names, terms, and so forth. It evidences no hesitation on the part of the early church to use Greek or other non-Hebraic terms and languages when necessary for the sake of the gospel. The early church used the linguistic tools it had at its disposal, and sometimes to great effect, to spread the gospel. Now, what is the evidence for Greek being the original language of the New Testament? And this is not a comprehensive or complete list, just a summary list. Number one, all of the existing manuscript evidence, surviving ancient manuscripts, copies of the New Testament, are all in Greek, whether complete copies or fragmentary. Number two, the ancient translations. Because Christianity was a mission-oriented religion, it wasn't too long before the need came up to take the New Testament documents and translate them into other languages, the earliest ones being Syriac, Coptic, and Latin. In each case, these translations were made from Greek originals. Number three, the witness of early church fathers. Early church fathers, such as the man who wrote 1 Clement, the letters of Ignatius, Polycarp of Smyrna, were all written in Greek. And where they allude to or quote the New Testament, they quote it in Greek from Greek sources. And I picked those three names because they're all from about the 95 AD to maybe 115 AD time frame, so they're relatively early. Now, the New Testament gives no indication of being a translation. By that I mean if you take a document of length and translate it from one language to English to German or whatever, there will be signs that what you are reading now in English is a translation. There are just too many differences between languages. You can't smoothly transition in every word and phrase over to a target language. And the New Testament just does not give any indications of being, it gives really no indication, solid indications of being a translation. Number five, the New Testament's use of the Greek Septuagint. If you're not familiar with it, the Septuagint was the old Greek translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek. And at least 50% of the Old Testament quotations and verbal allusions in the New Testament are based on the Greek Septuagint, not the Hebrew Old Testament. Although there are some authors, Matthew and Paul, who used both the Hebrew in some cases and the Septuagint in other cases. Now, if the New Testament was originally written in Hebrew, there's no way to explain this usage. Number 6, the New Testament itself in a number of places translates Aramaic and or Hebrew words and terms into Greek for a Greek-speaking audience. And I'm not going to read them. I just put about a half dozen examples. John 1, verse 38, when they said unto Jesus, Rabbi, which translated means teacher. Number 7, the authors of the New Testament utilized aspects of the Greek language as they put the documents together. Now, how they did so varied depending on their skill level of Greek, but they took advantage of certain aspects of the Greek language, and this is a fairly broad topic area, but this would include things like alliterations, word plays, using synonyms, double and even triple negatives in the Greek, compound words, and so on. Greek, for example, lends itself to the formation of compound words. That's when you take two or more individual words and put them together to produce a single resulting word. And Greek lends itself to that, and Hebrew, in fact, does not. About the only place where you find compound words in biblical Hebrew is proper names, like Yeshua. Number 8, the New Testament books also reflect the individual skill levels with Greek of the various authors, as well as their personality traits. And unfortunately, this is often lost in translation, even from Greek into English. The book of James, for example, is written in very good Greek. 2 Peter is, not so good. But if you read the King James, 2 Peter and James, they're going to both appear to be fairly comparable in quality. This is difficult to explain if the New Testament was written in Hebrew and then translated later into Greek. It's difficult to duplicate individual characteristics like that with any consistency when you translate all these books from various authors from Hebrew into Greek. And the natural tendency is going to be to smooth out things like bad grammar, to smooth out those certain personality traits. Paul at times could be quite irritable. And that just doesn't sound right. This is supposed to be an apostle of Jesus Christ. We don't want to think of him as having anger issues or anything like that. So the tendency would be to smooth out those rough edges. Well, we don't have that in the Greek New Testament. And again, unfortunately, a lot of these things are lost in translation into English. Now, ninth, I've got a practical point, and that is by this time, by around 30 to 40 AD, the Roman Empire, the most common language spoken was Greek, particularly in the eastern half of the empire. Now, not everybody spoke Greek, but of all the languages spoken in that, especially in the eastern half of the empire, Greek was the most dominant. And this has to do with past history, the conquest of Alexander the Great, the later Greek kingdoms, and so on. And Greek had become the de facto standard language of commerce. It was so common that a common practice of Roman magistrates, when they printed an edict for the local town to read, next Friday's a holiday, whatever, a common practice was to print those in both Greek and Latin, even though Latin was the official language of the Roman government. Now, Christianity was a mission-oriented religion given the task of taking the gospel to every nation. Now, if you are going to do that task, when it comes time to pick your medium of communication for at least your written documents, the most practical choice at that time would be Greek. One of the most impractical choices would be Hebrew. It makes no sense to think of the New Testament authors trying to spread the gospel to all these different nations using the Hebrew language. The idea of an original Hebrew New Testament cannot explain the existence, along the same lines, cannot explain the existence of certain New Testament books. Why would the Apostle Paul waste his time composing a letter in Hebrew to be sent to the church at Corinth, which is in the middle of Greece, and was largely Gentile in makeup? I mean, there would be no point to it. And Paul wasn't a stupid man. I just can't see him wasting his time putting together this long letter in response to issues and questions from the Corinthians and putting it together in a form or a format that they couldn't read. What would be the point of that? Now, what is the evidence for a Hebrew original New Testament? Well, existing ancient Hebrew manuscripts. There are none. There are none, period. Now, as far as ancient translations that of the New Testament made from a Hebrew original into Coptic, Latin, Syriac, and so on, there are none. The only real evidence is an enigmatic quotation from an early church father from Hierapolis named Papias. Now, Papias supposedly wrote, and I'm not going to go through all this, but in this article I got about a page worth of description about Papias and why it really doesn't amount to substantial evidence. But we know very little about him. He was a bishop in Hierapolis, which is what is now present-day Turkey. He was a bishop. He had been a disciple of Polycarp, and he supposedly reportedly wrote a 5-volume commentary on the sayings of Jesus. Now, none of his writings have survived, nor have copies of his writings survived. We only have a few fragmentary quotations that were written down long after the fact by some later church fathers, including a short enigmatic statement about Matthew having been written in a Hebrew dialect. And we have that quotation preserved by Eusebius, the church historian, writing about 200 years after Papias died, where he preserves that quotation. But because none of Papias' writings have survived, there's no way to corroborate or substantiate that quotation. How do we know that Eusebius has it written down accurately? And for that matter, how do we know that Papias was even correct in the first place? He actually himself wrote in Greek. And the word that he used when he described Matthew being in a Hebrew dialect is a word that could refer to either Aramaic or Hebrew, and there's no way to know for certain which one he meant. So that's your evidence for a Hebrew original. A quotation that cannot be independently verified, that has several ambiguities in it. And to return to my practical point, in light of Jesus' command to preach the gospel to all nations, writing or translating the church's core documents in the Hebrew just makes no sense. Unless all you want to do is limit your appeal to Hebrew-speaking Jews. At this point in time, most Jews did not use Hebrew as their standard language, and a lot of them no longer understood it. Outside of Palestine, Greek would be the native language most commonly found among Jewish populations. Now, what is noteworthy in all this is, in claims about this supposed Hebrew original is the lack of substantive evidence for it. This is in contrast to the mountain of evidence for Greek original. The evidence for Greek as the original language of the New Testament is substantial, extensive, and overwhelming. In contrast, the evidence for a Hebrew and or an Aramaic original is almost non-existent. It just isn't there. This is a lot of fluff with no substance behind it. Now, does it matter? And why does it matter whether the New Testament was written in Hebrew and Greek? And by the way, even if Papias' quotation was accurate, at best it demonstrates that Matthew may have been written in Hebrew or Aramaic, and because his comment is only applicable to the Gospel of Matthew, assuming he meant the same document that we now think of as Matthew, and that's not clear. Now, included in these claims that the New Testament was penned in Hebrew are insinuations and sometimes outright charges that the Greek New Testament contains corruptions. Pagan ideas introduced by the later, largely Gentile and Greek-speaking church. It thus becomes necessary to correct those corruptions utilizing the original Hebrew New Testament. How do we do that? Because we don't have an original Hebrew New Testament. There's no way that we can go back and correct those corruptions to the Hebrew original because it doesn't exist. At best, what these proponents of this position can do is speculate or guess at what they think or hope the Hebrew original said. And some of these guys now are beginning to translate the Greek back into Hebrew. That's their way to recover the original Hebrew. And that's another whole can of worms. And it becomes a real problem because Greek and Hebrew are vastly different languages. They are significantly different. And if you're going to go from Greek to Hebrew, you're going to have some real problems. And if you get 10 guys doing that exercise on one verse, you're going to come up with 10 different translations. Now, here's the satanic agenda in all this. And I'm not referring to the motivations of any human instruments involved with this. I don't doubt that most people involved are very well intentioned. There is a satanic agenda in all this, and that is to undermine Christian confidence in the Greek New Testament. Because there is no Hebrew alternative to fall back on. Therefore, if we decide that we cannot trust the Greek New Testament, that it is not correct, that it is not the original, where do we go from there? If we do not have reliable and accurate copies of what Jesus and the apostles actually taught, then we do not have a subjective and steadfast source for right Christian conduct in belief, and we might as well pack our bags and go home.